I trained as an immunologist, microbiology and then immunology. I did my DPhil back in Oxford many years ago. And I then worked on a clinical trial for an HIV research after my PhD. But in the meantime, I had worked across West Africa, mostly on research in the Gambia. And it always struck me how hard it was for healthcare workers to actually reach all those in need. This was back in the year 2000. Some things have changed, but many have not yet since then. And what I saw is that whilst healthcare workers really found it difficult to reach patients, the most remote areas, we had certain businesses, particularly beverage businesses, that seemed to be everywhere. So I wanted to understand that. And I didn't think, personally, for me, I always loved science, but personally, for me, it was about the quest and the impact that science can actually have in people's lives. So for me, it was important to actually understand if one day we were to have an HIV vaccine, how could we make sure that it would reach all those in need? So I was very fortunate. I applied to a school scholarship from the Said Business School and the School Foundation to do an MBA, to understand the entrepreneurial perspective, the business perspective, distribution channels, supply channels. And that led me to then go back to the Gambia, try to create a project back in 2007 on trying to use mobile phones to actually help healthcare workers reach patients, because the population is just very mobile across West Africa. Landline infrastructure is basically non-existent, and it made sense at the time, though not many people agreed at the time, because some people said mobile phones in 2007, where most places don't even have electricity, makes no sense. And that's what led me to policy, because we had a massive challenge at the time. We were ready to actually start our project. Initially, we had contacts with NGOs. We were working with the Medical Research Council in Fajara, with whom I had worked since 2000. But then the president at the time declared he could cure HIV and AIDS, which obviously meant we couldn't do anything using mobile phones. We wanted to use a boat clinic as well that would not talk about HIV, but obviously would address it. And there was nothing we could do. And then that led me to think how important policy and decision making are in terms of any impact we want to have in healthcare, but also in terms of the science as well. So there's many links after that. I actually went on and worked in government and in policy, health policy with UN, because I wanted to understand the policy side as well.
Do you consider yourself a science diplomat in a way?
I think there are many, many opportunities for science as a tool for diplomacy, because I think science really doesn't have borders. I mean, we all know that, or at least it shouldn't have any borders. Most of us, if not all of us, working in science, we're working towards the greater good, independently of whether it's one country or another. And there's actually there was a very interesting conference I went to in Jordan a couple of years ago, in November 2017, which was precisely about science for peace. And it was precisely about that, trying to understand how science could actually be a hub to bring together different countries and different populations in the region, which is a region that we know has had several tensions throughout the decades. And it was actually quite interesting to see how there were some examples where particular research projects, particular consortiums really brought together people from across different countries that otherwise might not have had the opportunity to even interact.
What do you see in the scientists just to be able to become these diplomats or these scientists?
All the scientists that I've come across, without exception, have actually been initially very driven, very motivated. Sometimes research, or the idea we have of research, I'm sure you've come across this as well, initially is a little bit more flourish than in reality it is. There's a lot of work throughout the years that is just actually a lot of routine, right, in the laboratory. And I think sometimes in science, we sometimes get demotivated throughout the years in that process of actually, where am I going to go? Is this science an academic exercise, or is this actually going to have impact in the real world? And I think in that impact in the real world, they're both very important exercises, obviously across different disciplines, but I think it's that impact in the real world that I think sometimes scientists, like myself, we struggle to understand how this can actually happen. In my case, I came across the fact that decision making was actually crucial if we wanted to have impact in terms of countering the spread of HIV, for example. And it's not just science, it's also prevention, education, is across the whole spectrum. So I think there's a lot to be understood in terms of how scientists sometimes can communicate their ideas in a manner that it can actually be understood by a broad audience and not just experts or other scientists in the field. So I think there's a lot there's a gap there. I think there's also very important for scientists to actually have an understanding of how the science itself can actually inform decision making, and also vice versa, how decision makers can actually understand science. And in terms of your specific, without not going so much into the business and entrepreneurship, but specifically into the policy and diplomacy, I think there's a lot of opportunities for dialogues to actually happen, but very honest dialogues, deep understanding of what science actually means, how it can actually influence decision making, but then the other side as well, to actually, for decision makers to actually understand the science and what it entails. On top of it, I think there's also a role here for the communication, social media and media in general, to actually perhaps be a bit more careful in how some facts are interpreted, analyzed, and then communicated to the broader audience as well. So I think, going back, this is a very long answer because I'm just thinking about it as you ask me. I think there's an opportunity for science to basically communicate, understand how they communicate their ideas in a way that can be understood by a broader audience, to try to understand also the perspectives of others in the field of outside the field, decision makers. I think it's so important to just observe and try to understand the perspective of others as well. Business perspective is important too, because a lot of the science is funded not just via grants, but sometimes via private sources as well. So that's important as well.
Yeah. So it may be that science diplomacy is not new necessarily, right? For these collaborations, if we understand them like that. But today, which could be some of the drivers, like driving these collaborations? What is it?
I actually think it's not new at all. If we go back to the time of the Greeks, for example, a lot of the rhetoric was actually linked to science, to mathematics, to astronomy. So there's many, many links in terms of policy and science that go back hundreds of years. In terms of moving forward, wow, that's probably a very complex question. I don't think there's one single solution. I think, again, honest debates amongst scientists and diplomats, for example, decision makers and diplomats. They play different roles as well with scientists. In turn, this can be facilitated by universities, for example, right? It's one important aspect. In another university that I work with, there's actually been elements of training, for example, future or current decision makers in mid-career levels in terms of understanding what scientific evidence actually means and bringing in scientists, not just close to this dialogue with diplomats and decision makers, but also in terms of advising as well. But it's really a two-way dialogue.
how do you see shaping horizons in relation to this, and why taking part of shaping horizons?
I think it's really important because from my understanding of the 5 days and looking at the program, I think it's really interesting to actually prioritize. We have so many challenges nowadays that the fact that you actually prioritize these particular topics and bring in people from across the spectrums, and not just, or when you have expertise, you also have people from other areas or people that have broader experience outside of their area of expertise to actually have these panels, for example, panel discussions. I think they are so important. I think it's really interesting what you're doing in terms of having, the University of Cambridge actually working with counterparts in Latin America. I think this really is the way forward, and it's actually in terms of. I was listening to this particular magazine. I follow many magazines around the future of medicine and healthcare. Some I agree with, some I think might be a lot of wishful thinking, but I think there's some particular ones that actually show that some of the trends of the next few years will actually be intercollaboration across countries, across different regions. And I think this is actually more important than ever. And it goes to say how science really doesn't have borders or should not have borders.
So we have probably half of all participants coming from science or engineering, right? The other part maybe from social sciences or this area, because I know this because of the themes that we are tackling here in Shaping Horizons. But thinking about young people in general, what will you say to them, like as future scientists and probably making?
The most important thing I found was to always follow my passion. I think this is particularly important. With that, sometimes when we follow our passion, sometimes we are too focused in what we're doing. So together with that, I would say it's so important to just listen to other people and observe other people, just try to understand other people's perspective. I think many of the problems, not all, but many of the problems I think we have nowadays is precisely because a lack of that, a lack of sitting together, trying to understand and know the other person. So that's the other advice I would give. And then maybe a broader advice, if scientists really want future or current scientists that want to get involved in diplomacy, I think finding a mentor is actually particularly important, someone that can actually provide advice and then sometimes just the motivation to persevere.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.